While many families celebrate the arrival of bundles of joy, for others it is not so much a delightful moment, and this is because the new mothers are teenagers, a lot of whom have been impregnated by adults. This thorny subject is forever present, and it has once again resurfaced and highlighted by the recent delivery of Christmas babies. According to the Department of Health this year, 1,668 babies were delivered on Wednesday. 3 of them belonged to teenage mothers, including a 15-year-old. What are the legal provisions, we ask today on the program? And for more on this now, we're joined by Family Law Analyst Phiwokuhle Mathenjwa. Thank you so much for your time on the program this hour. Perhaps let's start with what the law says. Legally, if a minor falls pregnant, what stance does the law take?
Good morning to you and the viewers. Firstly, what can happen is that the child has got a right to education. They cannot be expelled from school. They've got a right also to choose if they want to terminate their pregnancy without the consent of the parents.
And also, just as you set the foundations around that on what the law say, I think it would also be important, Ms. Mathenjwa, to also just expand further on what the law actually favors at this time, because the rights of the child are always of paramount importance, particularly when we look at how these kids are sometimes shunned by their communities or even their parents during this time.
It is very much important for us to accept that it is all governed, or rather falls under the big umbrella being the Constitution. However, children's rights are governed by the Children's Act. Now, in as much as there are huge parental rights and responsibilities, now let's remember, the parent here is also a child, because a child is anyone below the age of 18 years. Now, it also places the responsibility on who now? The grandparents, because now they must assume these parental rights and responsibilities. Legally, yes, the minor child is a parent to another minor child. So now it also, amongst other things, causes strain to the communities at large. That is why I also had to touch on the fact that they cannot be expelled at school, and that they've got a right to consent to terminate their pregnancies without the consent of the parents.
And also just perhaps still on that, if both parents are underage, Ms. Mathenjwa, is there any sort of liability that can be involved, particularly when we look at the rights of schools? Because sometimes the reality is we have schools that decide to maybe give such children a break from the schooling system during that time. Just what legal avenues can parents explore when it comes to that?
Now, remember, the Criminal Procedure Act is also one legislation that plays a vital role here, taking into account also the Sexual Offences Act. Now, to answer your question, it is no if they are both minors, and if it was consensual sexual intercourse. But if it was not, we are all mandated to report any sort of sexual abuse and or any other abuse that the children may be exposed to.
And interestingly that you say that now, when it comes to parents, just what legal provisions are there? And I ask this because I'm also trying to get a sense of, are they legally required to seek intervention from law enforcement in the case of a detection of a teenage pregnancy?
Legally, no. But that is only if there is consensual sexual intercourse. As I have said, we are all mandated to report these offences, or if we just think knowledge, let me put it like that, knowledge is enough for us to go and report these offences. That is why there is a classified group of people like your health workers, educators that must report these offences. I term them as offences because if there is any sort of abuse towards a minor child, then it becomes an offence. Remember, even assisting or availing your child for one to do these hideous crimes, allow me to say so, then you must report that. You are also accused in a matter.
And, you know, now that you touch on that, Ms. Mathenjwa, I'm thinking of some of the power dynamics that are usually at play at times. Case in point would be there was a case in Limpopo, if I'm not mistaken, not in the distant past, where we heard of a young lady who was, reportedly lured by this, person who's supposedly an adult and gave them money and was giving them, clothes and financing their lifestyle in a way. And when this child came up pregnant, she was still shunned by the community, who were saying that she had it coming in a way, because what was she expecting if she goes the route of getting herself a sugar daddy? And those were some of the conversations that were being had at the time. I would assume from where I'm sitting, there's a need, and that need is for communities to also come together, particularly when we look at the law and sensitizing our communities to say that it's very important to note these things, first of all, but also report them, because there's a saying that it takes a village to raise a child.
And just to add on that, I fully agree with you. But to also add on that, there's an elephant in the room that still needs to be addressed. Child marriages. Remember, the Marriages Act defines a boy child as being eligible to get married at the age of 18. That is no longer a child. That's an adult. As soon as they attain the age of 18, they're an adult. However, it says a girl child can get married at the age of 16, and in fact up to 12 years, where the minister must give consent, even though there is amendments that have been proposed and that we are dealing with. But however, same is still, the position is still the same. It has not changed. And you find that in our communities, and or rather at Home Affairs, you find parents marrying their daughters to older men. And when we try to address this and try and report these offenses, you find that the parents are the perpetrators and the ones that are, in fact, encouraging that our children get married to these old men. And another a very sensitive and a very hurtful thing is that they are even getting married in terms of the customary marriages, becoming second wives, becoming third wives. And these are children. So at times you find that our health practitioners are reporting these offenses, and when parents are not being cooperative, yes, of course, social workers, the police can interview the children without the intervention of the parents or the consent of the parents. However, you find that now this child has been married off to this family. Then what becomes of it? Or they go to the extent of accepting little gifts, so little money. And yes, we can accept that poverty plays a role. However, our communities, in a way, still need to be educated. These issues need to be addressed. Even at school, we need to create schools to be a safe space for children to report these offenses, because once we try and address them, we only find that they've been married over to these older men. And now the statutory offense, or rather the Sexual Offences Act, now loses its power because now they are married.
And I like that you also mentioned that, because it sort of like takes us to somewhat of a root cause of this problem that we're facing now, and also this trend of ukuthwalwa, which is, commonly still practiced in the rural areas in the country. I know there was a conversation that I had a bit earlier in the year where, there were parents in distress. They were saying that they don't know what to do because their hands are tied, particularly when we look at how some of these young children are married off, as you've also rightfully said, Ms. Mathenjwa. Let's hear what the law says, particularly when it comes to this.
That is why I had touched on the Sexual Offences Act.
Yeah.
However, if the child has been married over, now the Marriages Act has more power than the Sexual Offences Act, because now it's no longer statutory rape.
Yeah.
It was consensual sexual intercourse with an older person. However, it is now governed by the Marriages Act. That is why we are all asking people to come up gun blazing in respect of the proposed amendments in terms of the Marriages Act when it concerns minor children. Because obviously now there is not much you can do if the child has been married over. But who marries a 12-year-old? Who marries a 15-year-old? They are still minor children who still also need to be taken care of. And their parents still have got parental rights and responsibilities. And then it also touches on one thing. if the father is not there, it does not appear rather on the birth certificate, let me put it in a layman's term like that, then who has got all the right and everything to say? It is only the mother who can consent that their daughter be married off at such a little age. And what is concerning and alarming is that the boy is not a minor because they are 18, but now the child, the girl is a minor child. And it speaks to what? The future. It speaks to their education. It speaks to their psychological effects that then come with all those things after that.
Yeah, and it's quite a cause for concern there, and I think we'd really need all hands on deck, particularly when it comes to this. And also just to bring it back to what we're talking about today, Ms. Mathenjwa, just bringing it back to our healthcare spaces. What happens when healthcare workers are also confronted by a case of teenage pregnancy, but the parents or legal guardians are not willing to cooperate on this front? Case in point would be maybe a family that says the person that impregnated a particular girl is supporting the family, so they're not going to be going the legal route, for instance. Just what legal options do some of these healthcare professionals have at that time?
They are still mandated to report it. It's an offense. The girl is still a minor. And if they're having any consensual sexual intercourse with someone above their age, which is 16, 18, 20, 30, it is still a criminal offense. And our healthcare practitioners are mandated to report these offenses with or without the consent of the parents. Let the law take its course.
And we also talk about the law, which is seemingly cut and dry also, Ms. Mathenjwa, but the reality is also implementation there can also just somehow be a stumbling block at times. Do you think that some of the laws that we have around this that look at, sexual offenses and all that actually fit for purpose, particularly when it comes to the practical implementation thereof?
Yes, they do. However, it is the understanding of our communities that rather seems to be a concern, especially for me. That is why I had said even earlier on, education is key. We need to educate our communities. The fact that you avail your child, you expose your child to pornography, that's a criminal offense. And all these legislations are brought about to address these concerns. However, because people are not aware, or rather ignorant, they tend not to know them, and they tend to want to address it by saying it's their customs and all of that. However, there is legislation that is fit to address these issues. However, we need to understand that we are all mandated to report these offenses, and in fact, failure to report is an offense, and one can be convicted and sentenced to a period of 5 years for failing to report that a child is exposed to any sort of abuse.
Just where does a family go? Because so much has also been said around access, particularly when we look at your rural areas, such as your Ikopo, where you have families who are encountered with such situations where they say now, we don't have access to the family court. We don't know where to go about reporting what has just happened to our child. Where do they go? Because so much has been said about access, particularly to our legal justice system to help such families.
I truly appreciate that question, because most people confuse where we report these offences. Every magistrate's court is a children's court. They are also vested with powers that were before only at the High Court. For example, guardianship. Now you can apply for it at the children's court. However, you need to understand every magistrate's court is the children's court. Number two, we report GBV, rather, let me say, your protection orders, your harassments and everything at courts. We don't go to the police station. We go to court. The clerks of court assist us to fill in forms. Normally, they are ordinarily Form 2s. We fill them in. And if it concerns a minor, they are treated as urgent matters. And then when we speak of assault and all these criminal offenses, then we go to the police station. Now, communities need to understand the difference. Protection order, harassment, your GBVs, your allegations, you go to the court. And every court is a children's court.
I must thank you so much for your time and insights here on the program. That was certainly helpful. That's Family Law Analyst Phiwokuhle Mathenjwa joining us there for that conversation. Thank you so much indeed for your time.